It began with a letter. It arrived in the fall of 1934, addressed to the Budd family of Manhattan, handwritten on yellowed paper, its ink trembling with age or madness. The envelope carried no return address, but inside was a confession, a grotesque, detailed account of what had happened to their little girl Grace Budd, who had vanished 6 years earlier. The letter claimed she had never made it to her supposed friend's birthday party, never wandered off by accident. Instead, it said she had been murdered, butchered, and consumed by the very man who sat at their table that fateful day. A man they had invited into their home. A man named Albert Fish. It was a letter that would unravel the fabric of America's innocence. At the time, the public saw Fish as a frail old man, soft-spoken, grey-haired, almost grandfatherly. But beneath the humble exterior lurked a monstrous predator, one who preyed not only on children, but on the very idea of decency. In the decades before his name became synonymous with evil, Fish had moved quietly through society, a phantom cloaked in the ordinary. A painter, a handyman, a religious man, he blended in, and that made him far more dangerous. Albert Fish was not a killer in the traditional sense. He was something else, something darker, something that didn't seem fully human. And by the time law enforcement caught up with him, the horrors he left behind stretched far beyond Grace Budd into the lives of dozens of families and into the nightmares of an entire nation. To understand how such a monster could exist, how he could hide in plain sight for decades, we must journey back not just to the moment Grace vanished, but to the birth of the monster himself. What shaped Albert Fish? What forces molded him into the embodiment of the real-life boogeyman? The story begins in Washington, D.C. in the year 1870. Born Hamilton Howard Fish. He was the youngest of 4 children in a family already crumbling from within. His father, Randall Fish, was 75 years old at the time of Albert's birth, old enough to be his grandfather. His mother, Ellen, was half Randall's age. The family was poor, burdened by mental illness, and bound together by a threadbare connection to a fading American dream. Randall Fish died when Albert was just 5 years old, and with that any semblance of stability vanished. Ellen, unable to care for her son, placed him in an orphanage. It was there within those walls of supposed refuge that the first cracks in Albert's soul were carved. The orphanage was not a place of safety. It was a house of cruelty. Albert was beaten regularly. The caretakers used whips, paddles, and belts, often with little provocation. But what haunted him most wasn't the pain, it was the feelings that followed. He began to enjoy it. The physical punishment ignited something within him that he didn't understand. Something shameful. Something that would fester and mutate over the decades. By the time he left the orphanage, he was no longer a child. He was a boy with a secret he didn't know how to explain. A secret that whispered to him in the night. As he grew older, Albert began to explore the strange impulses developing inside him. He engaged in self-harm beatings and eventually cannibalistic fantasies. He read religious texts, obsessively twisting their meaning into justification for his desires. He became convinced that pain was sacred, that God wanted him to suffer. And worse, that God wanted others to suffer through him. Fish married in 1898 and fathered 6 children. On the surface, he seemed like any struggling working-class man. He held jobs as a painter and handyman. He moved his family from home to home. But beneath that mask, he was evolving into something monstrous. He began experimenting with sadomasochism, inserting needles into his body, dozens of them, and leaving them there. X-rays would later reveal over 20 needles embedded deep in his groin and abdomen. At night, when his children were asleep, Fish would wander the streets. He frequented brothels not for sex, but to be whipped, beaten, and degraded. But even that wasn't enough. His urges began to darken. It wasn't long before Albert Fish's fantasies turned outward. He began targeting the most vulnerable children. He would later claim that God commanded him to torture and consume the innocent, and he believed it. His religious delusions offered him absolution, even as he committed acts of unspeakable horror. In 1928, he answered a classified advertisement placed by a young man named Edward Budd. Edward was looking for work on a farm. Fish arrived at the Budd family's apartment in Manhattan, posing as a wealthy farmer named Frank Howard. He said he needed help on his upstate property. He was polite, charming, soft-spoken, a gentleman. The Buds liked him instantly. But it wasn't Edward that Fish wanted. It was Grace. 10-year-old Grace Budd was innocent, sweet, and trusting. She called Fish Grandpa within minutes. When he suggested taking her to his niece's birthday party, her parents saw no danger. After all, he was a respectable man. What harm could come? They never saw her again. The crime itself would remain a mystery for years. Police searched posters where printed tips poured in, but Grace had vanished into thin air. No one suspected the kindly old man. And Fish, like a ghost, disappeared. It wasn't until that horrific letter arrived 6 years later that the truth emerged. A letter in which Fish confessed in vivid and grotesque detail how he had murdered and eaten Grace Budd. He claimed it brought him joy that her flesh was sweet, that he felt no remorse. The letter was not just a confession. It was a trophy, a final act of cruelty. It was the letter that finally led to his arrest. But the nightmare was far from over. As investigators dug deeper into Albert Fish's past, they uncovered a history soaked in blood depravity and madness. Grace Budd was not his first victim, and she wasn't his last. Who was this man? This predator who called himself a child of God, even as he devoured the flesh of innocence? The public wanted answers, the police wanted justice, and the courts they had to decide was Albert Fish a madman or something worse. In the wake of Albert Fish's arrest, the press descended like vultures. Headlines screamed of cannibalism, child murder, and madness. The public recoiled in horror, not only at the crimes themselves, but at the revelation of who had committed them. Not a shadowy figure lurking in alleyways, not a drifter or a madman foaming at the mouth, but a 64-year-old man with grey hair, polite manners, and the kind of face you might trust to watch your children. But behind those tired eyes was a mind ravaged by obsession. As police interrogated Fish, they began to piece together a life of escalating horror. His confessions came not with shame, but with a bizarre sense of pride, as if recounting his crimes was a sacred duty. He claimed God had given him these desires, that the voices of apostles and angels had whispered instructions to him. He believed he was on a divine mission to inflict pain, to cleanse through suffering, to consume the purest souls. Detectives sat stunned as Fish rattled off the names of children he had targeted, some killed, some he had merely fantasized about, some whose names were lost to time, and others who were still being searched for by grieving parents. He spoke of a boy named Billy Gaffney, a 4-year-old who vanished in 1927. Fish described in excruciating detail how he had taken the boy, tortured him, and then, in his own words, cooked his little monkey behind. He had saved parts of the child for days, seasoning and frying them, savoring the experience like a gourmet meal. What shocked investigators even more was the calm, soft-spoken tone in which he said it all. Albert Fish wasn't ranting or raving. He wasn't shouting to the heavens or scribbling in tongues. He was deliberate, composed, lucid. He spoke like a man recounting the weather or a recipe, which raised a terrifying question. Was he truly insane, or was he simply evil? That question would follow Fish to his trial. But to understand his behavior, authorities needed to dig deeper. They began investigating his past, looking for the roots of his pathology. What they found was a history of abuse, isolation, and mental illness that spanned generations. Fish's family tree was a tangle of madness. His uncle had suffered religious hallucinations and was confined to a mental asylum. His brother was institutionalized. His mother experienced visual disturbances and emotional instability. Even his own children later recounted witnessing him whisper to unseen voices, flagellate himself, and disappear for days on end without explanation. His youngest son, John, described seeing his father beat himself with a paddle studded with nails while reciting verses from the Bible. Yet these same children said Fish never laid a hand on them in anger. He was a doting father in many ways, present, affectionate, even protective. They recalled him making breakfast, attending church, reading bedtime stories. It was as if he lived two lives, one as a kindly patriarch, and the other as a demon who walked among men. That duality, the split between persona and pathology, was at the heart of the psychological puzzle. Fish wasn't merely a product of abuse or insanity. He was something far more complex, a man whose sadism and spirituality were intertwined. He didn't hurt children in spite of his beliefs. He did so because of them. In his twisted theology, suffering was a gift. Pain was holy. He quoted from the Bible, frequently latching onto verses about sacrifice, torment, and divine punishment. He saw himself as both executioner and martyr. He inserted needles into his own flesh to purify his body. He carried cat-o'-nine-tails homemade whips that he used on himself during prayer. When questioned, he explained it all with calm conviction. I did it to feel what Christ felt on the cross. This religious fervor combined with his sexual deviance created a predator like no other. Fish was not driven by rage or revenge. He did not kill out of impulse. He planned. He stalked. He waited. His crimes were ritualistic, almost ceremonial. Each act was deliberate, chosen for maximum emotional and physical suffering, not just for his victim, but for himself. He wanted to feel their fear, taste their flesh, absorb their pain. It was this obsession with pain, both giving and receiving, that made him one of the most disturbing figures in American criminal history. But Fish wasn't always alone. As police examined his travels across the East Coast, they discovered he had often taken jobs as a house painter in various cities, jobs that gave him access to neighborhoods, to unlocked doors, and to children playing unattended. Many of his crimes remain unconfirmed, lost to time, or cloaked in silence. There were whispers of disappearances in Baltimore and Philadelphia, in Boston, always near places Fish had visited. But without bodies, without witnesses, those cases remained unproven. Still, the circumstantial evidence was chilling. A pattern emerged. He would arrive in a city, work briefly, and then leave usually around the same time a child went missing. It was as if he floated across the country like a ghost, leaving only heartbreak in his wake. Back in New York, the police focused on the Gracebud case, which had finally reopened thanks to the chilling letter Fish had mailed. The handwriting was their only lead. An analysis traced the stationery to a boarding house where Fish had lived under an alias. He had used the address to avoid detection, and it worked for years. It was a sharp-eyed janitor who ultimately broke the case open. After noticing a strange, silent man checking into the boarding house every few days, the janitor reported him. The name he gave Albert Fish matched the police's growing list of aliases. Detectives set up surveillance. When Fish returned, they pounced. The arrest was quiet. He didn't resist. He didn't run. He simply nodded and said, "I expected this." Once in custody, Fish opened up in ways few killers ever do. He talked at length about grace, about Billy Gaffney, about the needles in his body, about the voices of God. He answered every question as if he were recounting the past to an old friend, not a detective. There was no remorse, no shame, just a need to tell his story. And so the investigation turned into something else entirely, not a manhunt, but a descent into one of the darkest minds in American history. Prosecutors had a choice to make. Should they charge Fish with the murder of Grace Budd, the one case with clear evidence, a confession, and a victim whose body was never found? Or should they try to prove he was guilty of more, of Billy Gaffney, of Francis McDonnell, of other unnamed victims whose families still clung to hope? In the end, they chose the clearest path: charge him with Grace Budd's murder. But what they didn't expect was the defense Fish would mount. Not a denial, but an insanity plea. The trial would become one of the most sensational in New York history, not because of what Albert Fish had done, but because of what it revealed about the human mind and the chilling possibility that some evils are not born of madness, but of belief. January 1935. The courtroom in White Plains, New York was packed with journalists, psychologists, and morbidly curious citizens. Everyone had come for the same reason: to witness the trial of Albert Fish, the man who had confessed to killing and eating a little girl, and who now claimed that God had told him to do it. The prosecution had a straightforward case. Grace Budd was missing. Her parents confirmed that Fish had taken her. A confession letter, grotesque in its detail, had been mailed by Fish himself. Handwriting experts confirmed it. Witnesses tied him to the boarding house, and Fish didn't deny any of it. But the defense was prepared to argue something far more complicated: that Albert Fish was not legally responsible for his actions, that he was insane. The trial was never going to be about what Fish had done. It was going to be about why he had done it. To the defense, led by James Dempsey, a former prosecutor turned defense attorney, The issue was clear: no sane person could commit acts like these. Only a profoundly disturbed individual could describe in calm detail the murder, dismemberment, and consumption of a child and still sleep at night. Dempsey painted Fish as a man consumed by voices, delusions, religious hallucinations, and sexual madness, all woven into a mind diseased by decades of trauma. He called psychiatrists to the stand, some of the best in the field, who testified that Fish suffered from multiple disorders: paranoid schizophrenia, sadomasochistic psychosis, religious delusions, and a form of dementia. They cited his lifelong history of hearing voices, his obsession with biblical punishment, and his bizarre self-mutilation. Dr. Frederick Wortham, a renowned forensic psychiatrist, described Fish as the most complex case of abnormal psychology I have ever encountered. He told the court that Fish's belief system was so distorted that he genuinely thought he was fulfilling a divine mission. To Fish, pain was salvation both for himself and his victims. Wortham concluded that while Fish was aware of his actions, he lacked the moral and cognitive capacity to understand their wrongness. The jury sat in stunned silence. Then came the prosecution's rebuttal. They didn't need to prove that Fish was sane in a traditional sense. They only needed to prove that he knew right from wrong. And for that, they brought out witnesses who had seen Fish disguise himself, use fake names, and plan his crimes in advance. They emphasized how he lured Grace Budd with lies, how he covered his tracks, how he vanished after the murder. A truly insane man, they argued, does not cover his tracks. They pointed to his calculated use of aliases: Frank Howard, Thomas Sprague, and others. They emphasized his careful planning, his decision to use misleading job offers to gain trust, and his ability to vanish for years. Fish wasn't a raving lunatic, they said. He was a predator who knew what he was doing and who took pleasure in it. To drive the point home, the prosecution read the full letter aloud in court. It described in horrifying language how Fish had taken Grace Budd to an abandoned house, stripped her, strangled her, and then butchered her body with a saw. It recounted how he cooked parts of her on a stove, saving others in wax paper to eat over the next several days. The letter mentioned how her little behind was the sweetest meat I ever ate. The room fell silent. Even the judge looked shaken. Several jurors wept openly. It wasn't just a confession, it was a ritual. And yet Fish sat motionless, not smug, not remorseful, but blank, as if he had heard it all before, as if he had written it not out of pride but because he felt compelled to. The trial lasted 10 days. At the end of it, the question was left to 12 men and women. Was Albert Fish insane, or was he responsible for his crimes? After less than an hour of deliberation, the jury returned guilty. But what shocked the court even more was what came next. The jury had found him guilty, but they also recommended mercy, citing his clear mental illness. In the eyes of the law, he was sane enough to die, but perhaps not entirely sane in any other sense of the word. The judge had no room for nuance. Albert Fish was sentenced to death by electric chair. Fish showed no emotion. In fact, he seemed relieved. When asked if he was afraid, he replied no. "I don't even know why I'm here." To his final days, he insisted that God had guided him, that he had simply obeyed the voice of an angel. And as the sentence was handed down, America breathed a collective sigh of relief. But for many, that relief was haunted by something darker. Because even with Fish locked away, the question remained how many children had truly fallen victim to him. Officially, Fish was convicted of one murder, Grace Budd. He later confessed to at least 2 more, Francis McDonnell and Billy Gaffney. But police suspected far more. Dozens of disappearances scattered across cities with details that eerily matched Fish's patterns. Fish never gave a final body count. Perhaps he didn't know himself, or perhaps he enjoyed keeping that secret. One thing, however, was certain: the trial had not just revealed a murderer. It had exposed the darkest corridors of the human mind. A place where pain and religion blurred, where pleasure came from screams, and where evil wore the face of someone's grandfather. As he awaited his execution in Sing Sing prison, Fish seemed eerily at peace. He wrote letters. He drew. He prayed. When asked if he had any regrets, he said, "I have none. I've lived according to the will of God." He believed it. And maybe in some twisted corner of his fractured mind, that made it true. January 16th, 1936. The air at Sing Sing prison was heavy with anticipation. Outside its stone walls, reporters gathered like moths around a flame, their breath visible in the frigid night air. Inside the execution chamber was being prepared wires, tested straps, adjusted a wooden chair scrubbed clean, though no amount of polish could erase what it represented. Albert Fish, the man who had haunted the American public with tales of cannibalism, sadism, and religious madness, was about to die. But he didn't fear the chair. In fact, he welcomed it. Earlier that day, Fish had met with reporters and priests. His demeanor was calm, serene even. He had written a final statement, several pages of what he called my real story. When asked if it would ever be released to the public, his lawyer reportedly replied, "Not on your life." It was the most filthy string of obscenities I've ever read. To the very end, Fish remained a mystery, not just in his crimes, but in his motivations. A man who believed his purpose was divine, who found erotic pleasure in agony, who mutilated himself and others in what he saw as religious expression. At 11:06 p.m. he entered the death chamber. He sat in the chair with no resistance, no last words, only a faint smile. 2 electrodes were attached, one to his shaved leg, the other to his head, which had been coated with saline to improve conductivity. The executioner stepped back, gave the nod. A prison official threw the switch. A jolt of 2,000 volts surged through Fish's body. But something strange happened. For the first time in Sing Sing's history, the electric chair short-circuited. Smoke began to rise from Fish's body. A smell filled the chamber, acrid and thick. The generator had malfunctioned, supposedly due to the dozens of metal needles still embedded in Fish's groin and abdomen. His own history of self-torture had interfered with his execution. Technicians scrambled to reset the equipment. The second surge was successful. At 11:09 p.m., Albert Fish was pronounced dead. He was buried in the prison cemetery beneath a simple marker. No name, no mourners. But death did not silence the horror he left behind. In the weeks that followed, newspapers ran headlines like, "Grey Man Executed," and "Were There More Victims?" Radio shows debated the psychology of a killer whose actions defied explanation. Parents clutched their children tighter. Schools warned against talking to strangers. For the first time in modern American history, the public truly understood the predator next door. Albert Fish had become legend, and not the kind whispered in bedtime stories. He was the living embodiment of the boogeyman. His story reshaped how America thought about evil. No longer was it relegated to the shadows, to grotesque monsters or criminal underworlds. Now it had a face soft, grandfatherly, and terrifyingly normal. Psychologists studied Fish for decades. He became a case study in nearly every major textbook on forensic psychology. His symptoms, sadomasochism, schizophrenia, religious psychosis, cannibalistic obsession, became reference points. But no expert could fully explain him. Because Fish was not simply mad, he was not merely sick, he was something else. Even his own children struggled with how to remember him. His son John, who had once watched his father beat himself with nail-studded paddles, later said he believed his father had been possessed. His daughter Anna refused to speak publicly. The rest of his family faded into obscurity, changed their names, vanished. But the memories remained. So did the scars. Years later, Grace Budd's family still lived in the same apartment where they had last seen her alive. Her mother never fully recovered. She kept Grace's photo on the mantel until the day she died. Her father refused to speak Albert Fish's name again. And as decades passed, Fish's story evolved from historical case to urban myth. He became the Grey Man, the Moon Maniac, the Brooklyn Vampire, and most chilling of all, the real-life Boogeyman. His crimes inspired films, novels, documentaries, and nightmares. He has been compared to Hannibal Lecter, to Ed Gein, to fictional monsters that followed. But unlike those names, Fish didn't wear a mask. He didn't hide behind chainsaws or haunted houses. His horror came from how normal he seemed, and how profoundly he subverted that image. To this day, the name Albert Fish evokes something primal, not just fear, but revulsion, disgust, a visceral understanding that there are corners of the human mind that even science cannot illuminate. Desires so foreign, so destructive, that we recoil from them instinctively, because to look too closely is to risk seeing a piece of it within ourselves. Fish was not the first serial killer in America, but he was among the first to show the nation just how far depravity could go when cloaked in trust. And that perhaps is the most terrifying legacy of all, because monsters in the dark are easy to fear. But the ones who knock on your door, smile, and ask to borrow your child, they are the ones who never leave your mind. After Albert Fish was executed, a disturbing silence settled over America. For weeks, the public digested the incomprehensible facts of his crimes. But even as the headlines faded, a deeper conversation was just beginning, one that would stretch across decades into academic journals, law enforcement manuals, and psychological treatises. How could a man like Fish exist? That question echoed through the halls of psychiatry, psychology, and criminal justice alike. Up to that point in the 1930s, the field of forensic psychology was still in its infancy. The concept of serial killing had not yet entered the public vocabulary. Terms like psychopath, sexual sadist, or paraphilic disorder were not widely understood or applied. But the case of Albert Fish forced experts to reconsider everything they thought they knew about human behavior and about evil. Dr. Frederick Wertham, the forensic psychiatrist who testified at Fish's trial, would later become one of the most controversial figures in American psychological history. He not only examined Fish, but also documented every fragment of his disturbed mind. In his notes, Wertham wrote, "Fish's perversions were not merely sexual, they were spiritual. He turned pain into ritual. He turned God into a weapon." Wertham believed that Fish's mind could not be explained using any single diagnosis. Instead, Fish was an intersection of pathologies, a man where schizophrenia, psychosis, obsessive-compulsive behavior, and religious mania collided. His case helped shape the clinical understanding of sacrificial delusion, in which individuals believe they are called upon by a divine force to perform acts of torture or death. But more than that, Fish's case laid the groundwork for how law enforcement and psychologists began to approach sexually motivated killings. For the first time, investigators realized that some crimes were not committed for money, revenge, or passion, but for internal psychological satisfaction. The concept of the organized offender began to take shape, someone who could appear normal, intelligent, functional, and yet be capable of atrocities. This new understanding would later become central to the development of criminal profiling. In the 1970s, when the FBI launched its behavioral science unit, the team that would eventually form the foundation for Mindhunter and modern profiling techniques, the name Albert Fish was among the first studied. His meticulous planning, use of aliases, victim selection, ritualistic behavior, and post-crime communication all matched what would come to define a sexually sadistic serial killer. More importantly, Fish shattered the notion that appearance could be trusted. Until then, there had been comfort in believing that killers were easily identifiable, brutish, violent, unkempt, irrational. Fish destroyed that myth. He was soft-spoken, literate, polite. He wrote letters, attended church, paid rent on time. He lived unnoticed in boarding houses, ate quietly in diners, prayed beside his children at bedtime. And yet behind that mask of normalcy was something inhuman. That contradiction, the ability to hide in plain sight, became one of the most studied and feared aspects of modern criminal behavior. The term mask of sanity would later be coined by psychiatrist Hervey Cleckley in 1941 to describe individuals like Fish. Men who understood right from wrong, but who lacked empathy or remorse. Who used charm to gain access to victims. Who constructed public identities as camouflage. Fish wasn't just a killer, he was a warning. His crimes inspired a wave of caution in American society. Parenting manuals began to emphasize stranger danger. Children were taught not to speak with unknown adults, no matter how kindly they appeared. Schools began locking doors. Police departments instituted more detailed missing persons procedures. Entire communities changed the way they thought about safety. In a way, Fish became the blueprint for what not to ignore. And culturally, his legacy seeped into stories, legends, and nightmares. The idea of the cannibalistic predator, the monster who smiles then devours, appeared in books, horror films, television shows. While Fish's name might not always be directly used, his shadow is unmistakable. You see it in Hannibal Lecter, in Buffalo Bill, in countless horror villains that mix intelligence, religion, and ritual violence. But perhaps most disturbingly, Fish's legacy influenced others who walked similar paths. Over the years, serial killers like Andrei Chikatilo, Peter Kürten, and even Jeffrey Dahmer would draw eerie comparisons to Fish in their targeting of children, their fascination with flesh, and their bizarre justifications. Some, like Chikatilo, even mimicked Fish's behavior, biting flesh, displaying bodies, or confessing with morbid calmness. Albert Fish had opened a door and others followed. And yet, despite all the academic progress, all the cultural analysis, one question still lingers in every lecture hall, every case study, every terrified parent. Was Albert Fish born a monster or made into one? Some argue that the answer lies in his childhood, that the abuse he suffered in the orphanage, the beatings he came to enjoy, the mental illness that ran in his family, these factors converged into something inevitable, that society failed him first. Others believe that no amount of abuse or mental instability could justify what he became, that something inside him, something no doctor or theory could explain, was simply evil. Whatever the answer, the truth remains, his story changed the way the world sees predators. And more chillingly, it reminded us that monsters don't always hide in shadows. Sometimes they sit beside you at the dinner table. In the decades that followed Albert Fish's execution, his name took on a life of its own. He was no longer merely a man, not even just a killer. He had become folklore, a myth rooted in horrific truth. And like all legends, his story began to mutate, adapt, and embed itself into the collective imagination of American culture. Newspapers first helped immortalize him. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, true crime publications flourished. They printed gory, sensationalized accounts of Fish's confessions, often exaggerated and illustrated with haunting sketches of a grey-haired man standing over a stove slicing meat with a butcher's cleaver. Headlines branded him with names that would outlive his real one: the Werewolf of Wisteria, the Brooklyn Vampire, the Moon Maniac. But the name that stuck most, the real-life Boogeyman, it was a name that spread beyond print. Parents whispered it to children. Be good, or Albert Fish will come for you. In a time before mass television, oral storytelling gave him wings. He was the thing under the bed behind the closet door in the empty street when night fell. Not a demon, not a ghost. Worse, a man. And unlike the ghouls of folklore, Albert Fish had existed. He had walked the same streets, sat in the same churches, knocked on real doors. That was what made the terror so effective. He wasn't supernatural, he was familiar. Hollywood eventually took notice. Though few films have dared to use his name directly, the echoes of Fish are everywhere in horror cinema. Characters like Hannibal Lecter, with his refined taste and cannibalistic nature, share Fish's disturbing blend of intellect and savagery. The fictional killer Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs uses deception and manipulation to lure victims, just as Fish had posed as Frank Howard to gain the Budd family's trust. Even earlier films like Psycho, with its themes of religious repression, mother fixation, and hidden madness, mirrored Fish's fractured psyche. Norman Bates and Albert Fish are psychological cousins, men who appear mild, even fragile, but who carry unbearable darkness within. Later, the serial killer genre exploded. From C7N to Zodiac, from Mindhunter to Dexter, American media became obsessed with the psychology of murderers. And buried deep in many of those narratives are the seeds of Fish's legacy, the belief that the scariest monsters aren't grotesque but ordinary. That the most dangerous people are those you'd never suspect. True crime literature likewise kept Fish's memory alive. Books like Deranged by Harold Schechter dove deep into the details of his life, and Crimes pulling no punches in recounting the grisly specifics of what Fish did and what he believed. These works reintroduced his name to new generations, often sparking a renewed fascination with his story. By the 2000s, the internet brought Albert Fish into the digital age. Forums, YouTube channels, Reddit threads, and true crime podcasts began dissecting every detail. His letter to the Budd family was reprinted and narrated in countless videos, often with warnings about its disturbing content. Artists drew grotesque interpretations of him. Creepypasta stories and horror blogs invoked his name like a cursed incantation. In a strange way, Fish had become a genre unto himself. But why? Why does his story continue to resonate? Because Fish doesn't just represent horror, he represents uncertainty. We don't understand him. We don't want to. He doesn't fit into the categories we use to protect ourselves from fear. He wasn't acting out of vengeance. He wasn't driven by poverty or rage. His actions were born of desire, the purest and most terrifying kind, the kind he didn't feel guilty for. And that terrifies us, because if one man could believe such things, could enjoy such things, then what else lurks in the minds of strangers? What other faces, smiling and quiet, carry unspeakable secrets? Fish also forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about belief. He wasn't an atheist. He wasn't driven by nihilism. On the contrary, he was deeply religious. He read the Bible daily. He prayed before and after his crimes. He claimed to be acting under God's will. His theology was twisted, yes, but sincere, and that made him even more dangerous. It forces us to ask, how far can someone go when they believe they're acting for righteousness? That's the part that sticks. The blend of depravity and devotion. The calculated cruelty masked by kindness. The old man with needles in his body, who lured children not with violence, but with a smile and a soft voice. Over time, Albert Fish has become more than a cautionary tale. He's become a symbol of everything we don't want to believe could be true, but know might be. That's why his story endures. Not because we want to remember, but because we can't forget. Among all the questions Albert Fish leaves behind, none are more disturbing or more complex than the one at the center of his mind. Did he believe God wanted him to do it? In many ways, Fish was not just a killer. He was a zealot, a prophet of torment who saw pain as sacrament, blood as holy water, and flesh, both his own and his victims, as an offering. In his fractured theology, he was not a monster. He was a messenger. To understand the twisted power of Fish's beliefs, we must return to where it all began, the orphanage. At St. John's Orphan Asylum in Washington, D.C., young Albert was introduced to religion through brutality. The nuns who ran the orphanage preached discipline through pain. Beatings were common, not as punishment, but as purification. Suffering, they taught, brought one closer to Christ. Blood cleansed the soul. Tears washed away sin. These lessons were meant metaphorically, but for Albert Fish they were etched into flesh. As he grew, Fish began to associate pain with morality. The more he hurt, the more he believed he was pleasing God. But he didn't stop at receiving pain. Soon he decided he had been chosen to deliver it. He began interpreting Scripture literally and dangerously. The Old Testament, with its fire and sacrifice, its tales of divine wrath, became a roadmap. He cited stories of Abraham nearly sacrificing Isaac of God, testing his followers through suffering. But unlike the faithful who stopped short, Fish followed through. He believed God demanded blood. Even more terrifyingly, he believed that children were the purest offerings. Fish once wrote, "The angels appeared to me and told me that the children's pain would open the gates of heaven." It's a line that sounds like a hallucination, and perhaps it was, but Fish believed it with total conviction. He wasn't mocking God. He was worshipping his own monstrous interpretation. This delusion wasn't passive. Fish acted on it. When he kidnapped Grace Budd, he didn't just take her life. He made her death into a ritual. He fasted for days beforehand. He prayed. He brought her to an abandoned house not out of convenience, but because it was quiet enough for God to hear. He claimed he heard divine voices guiding him. He said he was not killing her, he was saving her. The letter he sent to her mother, filled with horror, was also filled with references to purity, sacrifice, and salvation. It wasn't just a confession, it was a sermon. But even outside his murders, Fish's religious mania colored every part of his life. He believed he had to suffer constantly to be worthy of God's attention. He inserted needles into his groin and abdomen, not just for sadomasochistic pleasure, but as acts of devotion. He used belts embedded with nails to whip himself while reciting psalms. He carried handwritten passages from Scripture folded in his coat, worn thin from repetition. And when his children caught him whispering to voices or drawing blood from his thighs, he told them simply, "I must feel what the Savior felt." Fish was not faking his faith. That's what made it dangerous. He distorted the image of God into something grotesque, a deity who demanded agony, who feasted on suffering, who smiled upon those who inflicted pain on the innocent. He was not the first to twist religion for evil. But few did it so quietly, so methodically, and so personally. Most of his crimes were committed alone in silence, in shadow, not for fame or chaos or greed, but for something darker: intimacy, a private communion between himself, the child, and the God he believed was watching. This spiritual delusion posed a unique challenge to psychiatrists. Was Fish mentally ill because of his beliefs, or did his beliefs cause the illness to grow? The answer was both. In modern terms, Albert Fish likely suffered from schizoaffective disorder, a condition blending delusions, hallucinations, and mood dysfunction combined with extreme paraphilic disorders. But what made him unique was how he organized those disorders into a system of faith. His evil had order. His madness had scripture. It's this order that separates Fish from many other serial killers. He wasn't driven by anger or impulse. His killings were slow, ritualistic, spiritual. He didn't just want the child to suffer. He wanted the child's suffering to mean something. That's what chilled even the most seasoned detectives. Because when a man kills in rage, it's horrifying. But when he kills in prayer, that's something else entirely. The role of religion in Fish's life also raised broader cultural questions. In the years after his trial, theologians, journalists, and psychologists debated, could faith, when misused, become a weapon of destruction? Fish's story became a case study, not only in criminal insanity, but in theological extremism. It forced society to reckon with the idea that even the purest human institutions, family, church, scripture, could be warped into engines of evil. And that perhaps was the most blasphemous part of all. Albert Fish didn't hate God. He loved him, and in that love he justified the unthinkable. Time has a way of blunting horror. Names fade, faces are forgotten, headlines are buried under newer, louder tragedies. But some stories resist erasure, not because they are retold, but because they are remembered, quietly, in nightmares, in whispers, in the unspoken rules parents teach their children. Never talk to strangers. Never open the door without asking. Never trust a soft voice with kind eyes. These warnings live on because of men like Albert Fish. Nearly a century after his execution, the name still chills. Not because of gore, not because of body count, but because of how close he got, how normal he seemed, how easily he blended in. In that way, Albert Fish forced a societal reckoning. Before fish monsters were imagined, they were creatures in the woods or shadows on the wall. But Fish showed America that monsters walk among us, that they don't growl, they whisper, that they don't need claws, they need only an invitation. And perhaps most disturbingly, that they can believe they're doing good. After Fish's trial, law enforcement began changing the way they investigated missing children. The idea that a stranger, especially an older man, might plan the abduction of a child, not out of anger or desperation, but out of calculated desire, reshaped everything. Background checks became more rigorous. Psychological evaluations gained importance. Sex crimes units began forming in larger cities. Even the media changed. Journalists stopped referring to predators as fiends or maniacs alone. Instead, they began using more clinical terms: disorder, pathology, predator. The tone shifted from moral judgment to forensic analysis. And in that shift, a strange kind of progress was born. Understanding, though painful, became the first step in prevention, and still Fish's shadow loomed. He was one of the first true crime figures to transition from fact to folklore. Urban legends began to borrow his silhouette, the grey man watching from the sidewalk, the whispering figure in a long coat, the nice old man offering candy. Even as fiction mutated his story, the core fear remained intact, the fear of deception. To this day, many true crime scholars consider Fish a Category 0, a prototype. He predicted the patterns seen in later serial killers, but with an added layer of complexity, religious delusion, masochism, cannibalism, and a complete lack of remorse. There is no single word that encapsulates Albert Fish. Not killer, not sadist, not even madman. He was a collapse of categories. A soul unraveling into raw impulse. A man who used discipline as disguise and righteousness as justification. A man who could kneel in prayer, then slice a child to pieces. What do we do with that? For some, the answer is to turn away, to forget, to label him an outlier, a freak, an aberration. But history teaches us otherwise. Fish is not the only one. He was not the last. His name is written beside others, now men who shared his darkness in different forms: Andre Chikatilo, Peter Curtin, Jeffrey Dahmer, Richard Ramirez. Each of them carried part of the same sickness. Each of them wore the mask of civility. And each of them forced us to confront the thin, fragile line between man and monster. Albert Fish walked that line until it vanished. In the end, he died without remorse, without apology, without ever understanding why the world saw him as evil. And perhaps that is the most chilling truth of all. Albert Fish didn't think he was a monster. He thought he was chosen. We tell ourselves that evil wears horns and breathes fire. But the story of Albert Fish teaches us something harder. That evil wears slippers, says Grace, smiles with tired eyes, that it borrows scripture, that it bakes bread, that it walks with a limp and asks if your daughter might like to attend a party, and then it disappears, leaving only silence. No scream, no trace, just a quiet question lingering forever. What if the real boogeyman was never under the bed, but sitting in your living room,